What does it look like to be grown in 2017? I don't know about you, but you probably remember a day where you realized, Mom and Dad ain't paying that bill anymore. I'm on my own. This is what being grown up looks like. We're going to talk about a grown-up gospel where adulting meets faith. And so what we're going to do is go through 4 individuals in the scriptures who had to grow up real fast. They hit an issue, they were out on their own, and what it looked like for them to become an adult when they were still maybe the age of a child. And so this morning we're going to read a familiar story, and we're going to look at adulting and what it looks like to be a grown-up. But before we do, I want to tell you another story that I wasn't planning on telling you until it happened Friday. I was with my wife, and we were at a store, and she wanted this shirt in this store, so she went in there. And I did what I do when she goes in that store. I just act like I'm looking around. There wasn't much for me. And there was this jacket on sale, and it was a pretty good price. I thought it was a nice jacket. It was my size. I put it on. It was pretty cool. I liked it a lot. It was just a black jacket, had a little zipper. And I'll admit, this store is one of those stores where they have a lot of 20-year-olds on the wall wearing their clothes. I get it. But I liked it, and I put it on, and I walked over to her like I do when I find stuff that I like, anticipating her say, that looks good, or, it's not for you. But she said something she's never said to me. I put it on, put my hands in the pockets, I said, what do you think? And she said, looks a little young for you. My heart was not prepared for those words to cross her lips. She's never said that. And so my face just went white. And she said, no. I took it off, I put it on the rack, and now she knows what she's like. She put her stuff, she's like, hey. I was like, no. You can't take that back. We're done. You get whatever you want. I'm not talking to you. And I told her later, I said, I had no idea I was middle-aged at this point. Wasn't allowed to shop in the mall anymore with you. And I started throwing barbs her way. You're older than me, And she just didn't even pay attention. She's like, I know, I shouldn't have said that. I said, but you said it. You said it. So I'm struggling this morning with the fact that I'm like more of an adult than I realize. I'm getting older, and this is how we've got to do. We got to deal with it. We got to deal with the fact we're adults, we're grown-ups, and there are hard decisions, harder than buying a jacket, but dealing with what life throws our way. And so this morning we're going to read a story that, funny enough, deals with a jacket, deals with brothers and sisters not getting along, and deals with a guy who had to adult real fast. If you have your Bible, I invite you to turn with me to Genesis. The words will be provided for you on the screen if you don't have the scriptures. But we're going to turn to Genesis chapter 37. We're going to turn around a little bit. We're going to turn here and there in Genesis. But we're going to read the story of a guy that you know about him because of the coat of many colors. His name was Joseph. And Joseph's dad really liked him, okay? His dad's name was Jacob. Jacob had a fondness for Joseph. It says, now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. And this is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them. Joseph, first thing you need to know, he's a bit of a tattletale, all right? 17 years old, telling on your 30 and 40-year-old brothers, okay? He was a little bit of a brown noser and a whole lot of a tattletale. So already you can see this guy's not Mr. Friendly with his brothers. They don't exactly love him. He's one of the youngest at this point. But then read on, Genesis chapter 37. Notice it says in verse 3, now Israel or Jacob loved Joseph more than all his children. Bad parenting right there, okay? If you have a favorite, don't let it be so clear that when your life story is written, it said, and everyone knew that his favorite was this one, all right? He gave him a coat of many colors, and he did all these things, and it was just so obnoxious. His brothers were like, oh my goodness. Can you imagine if like one of your siblings was the favorite and your parents bought them this gaudy, awful, nuts-looking jacket? Like, we want everyone to know when our favorite is walking from a mile away. No, it would not do well for that child. And sure enough, Joseph is stupid enough to wear it. He's like, oh yeah, look, guys, don't you like, what do you think about what Dad got me? Well, it doesn't go well. You know the story. His brothers get jealous. But notice what else happens in verse 9. Genesis chapter 37 and verse 9. Then he dreamed another dream. He's been dreaming these dreams where he's like the star and he's everyone's attention. Like he says, guys, I had a dream last night. Listen, if you ever have this dream, don't tell everyone. He says, I had this dream last night where you were all bowing down and letting me tell you what to do. And his brothers were like, no, that's never going to happen, Joseph. He dreamed another dream. Notice this one in verse 9. And told his brothers and said, look, I have dreamed another dream. And this time the sun and the moon and the stars bowed down to me. Who is this guy telling his brothers all these things? Verse 10. So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come down to bow down to the earth before you? And his brothers envied or were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in his mind. Now, if you know the full story of Joseph, that will happen. But not when he's acting this way. Not right now. Here's the problem. Joseph wanted to go from 17 to being in charge, and that's just not how it works. Part of adulting is realizing, boy, we don't get to be in charge the day we turn 18. Amen? How many of you remember your first job when you had all these great ideas and everybody was like, great, yeah. Go back to what you're doing. I don't want to talk to you. Like, nobody cares what you think when you're 18. You think, well, when I turn 25, and sure enough, it's not quite there. Part of being an adult is knowing, and nobody cares about your dreams and aspirations yet, okay? You got to earn it. You got to work for it. So, you know the rest of the story. His brothers get jealous enough, they get mad enough, and he's been tattling on them, so they throw him in a pit. They're not sure what to do. Reuben, the oldest, is like, we should save him. And they're like, you're never in charge. We don't listen to you. Judah, who's actually in charge, he's the guy that people listen to. He's like, hey, wait a minute. We can make some money off of bro here. There's some people coming in. Let's sell him as a slave. Now, truthfully, these guys were not thinking, okay? Their story was terrible. They sell him for a little bit of money. They're all wealthy as it is. They don't need the money. And then dad's like, where's Joseph? They're like, oh, we thought maybe you forget about him. Well, he is my favorite. And they have to come up with this cockamamie story where they take his coat of many colors, they put blood on it from a ram, and their dad's like, oh, I guess he's dead. He doesn't really buy it. And for like the next 15 years, he reminds Judah, apparently, Joseph was killed under your watch. And he's always like really snide with it. He's like, I know what you did. But you know what happens? Joseph is sold. He goes over to Egypt. And in Egypt, his story gets a little bit worse. He goes from being a son of a pretty wealthy guy with some pretty wealthy brothers who don't like him, but at least he has a nice, cool coat. That goes downhill real fast. He goes into a pit. Now he's sold as a slave. Look over with me at Genesis chapter 39, and we'll read what happens to him next. He was sold. There's this guy named Potiphar. He owns him. But notice verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Notice verse 3, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord had made all that he did to prosper in his hand. Joseph had this thing called favor. You know what I mean? Just everything seemed to fall in line for him, and God was blessing him, and God prospered him. And so his master said, this is great. Verse 4, so Joseph found favor in his sight and served him, and then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. He says, man, you are so good with everything. Everything you touch turns to gold. You take care of the servants. You take care of the house. You take care of the animals, the farm. Man, you rule it all. This is great. I come home, I kick up my loafers, and I just hang out. And it worked out great until, the rest of the story. Potiphar had this wife who found Joseph attractive. And the Bible does say he was attractive in form and figure. Can you imagine having a little brother that was good looking, had a nice coat, and wanted to tell you all of his dreams? Boy, a guy like that would really bother me. And he bothered his brothers, and he bothered some other people. But this lady, she found him attractive. So she started coming on to him. And she wasn't subtle at all, okay? But the Bible says that Joseph rebuked her. He said, I cannot do that to my God and to my master. Let's rewind here. Your God has allowed your life to go pretty awful for the last few years, but he's still honoring God. He still honors him. Well, one day he walks in and she grabs him by the coat. She says, you're going to spend some time with me. And he runs out and she rips off his outer cloak, okay? And she holds on to it. She tells a story when her husband gets home and says, he was mocking me. He was coming on to me. Now, Potiphar probably didn't believe the story because Potiphar doesn't kill Joseph. He would have had every right to kill a slave who came onto his wife. Truth is, Potiphar probably knows his wife pretty well, so he says, oh, what a terrible guy. Throw him in prison. Just throw him in prison. He still probably believes, but he has to honor his wife and her word. So now Joseph has been a brother, he's been a slave, and he finds himself in prison. And in prison, you would think this is where Joseph says, you know what? Serving this God, honoring this God is not really working out as well as I thought. So I'm just going to do my own thing, go on a bender, have some fun, enjoy myself, or just get super cynical and not believe anything. But That's not what happens. In the prison, he's faithful, and sure enough, the prison sets him up. The guards trust him to where he's in charge of the prison. Can you imagine if you went into a jail and the warden said, yeah, this guy's been really good lately, so we just give him the keys, Let him handle all the prisoners as they come and go. He seems like a pretty good guy. He's not from around here, but we all like him a lot, so we just kind of go along with it. That's what happened. Joseph is in charge of this prison. Basically what happens is there's a bunch of lazy people who are like, oh, he'll do the work. Let him do it. I don't do it, whatever. But Joseph is faithful. He's honorable, and things work out. And a few years in, there's these two guys. They wake up one morning, they're like, we have had a terrible dream. These guys were in prison who had just worked for Pharaoh himself. They were his cupbearer and his baker, and they had these terrible nightmares. And Joseph said, now, it's not me, but God can interpret any dream. Tell me your dream. And sure enough, he tells them, man, your dream is good. It means in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to bring you back, and you'll be serving just like you were. And the baker says, let me tell you my dream. And he tells him, and Joseph says, oh, yeah, yours is not as good. Tell me. He's like, well, you'll see. He said, in 3 days, Pharaoh's going to put you to death. And the guy's like, I hope you're wrong. And he wasn't. Unfortunately, Pharaoh decided to kill this one and put this one back. And on his way out, Joseph says, hey, man, remember me when you get up there, when you get in Pharaoh's ear. I've done nothing wrong here. Just tell him my story. And the Bible says he forgot. Not for a month, not for 2 months, but for quite some time, a few years. And at this point, Joseph has been away from his family. He's a grown man in prison. And he's wrestling with what being an adult looks like when life just doesn't go your way. And that brings me to this morning's thought. I'm not going to give you 3 points or a poem or anything like that. I'm going to give you one simple thought that was true in Joseph's life, and it's true in every one of our lives when it comes to adulting, when it comes to being a grown-up. And it's this. I discover purpose in who I am, not what I do. Hear me. The world will tell you that you only find purpose when you make this amount of money, when you have this title next to your name, when things are going really well. I know people who have money, who have a title, who have success, but are not at peace with who they are. Joseph in that prison needed to come to grips with who he was, not what he did. Because no one was impressed when he said, well, they let me hold the keys and they get into jail, so I'm kind of a big deal. No, they weren't impressed with that. Joseph had to figure out who he was. And there's a couple things you need to know about who you are, and Joseph had to figure about who he was. Number one, he was loved. I know it didn't feel like it. I know it didn't seem like it, but God loved him and God cared for him. And the longer, every day he was in that prison, I'm sure he wondered, how much do you love me, God? I remember wearing a coat and having things go in my way, and now I'm in jail. But he knew in his heart God loved him. God cared for him. He knew God had a purpose for him in his circumstance. And slowly but surely, he would see that purpose revealed. But he had to come to grips with who he was. This morning, I want you to put aside what everyone has told you you are supposed to do. I want you to set aside what everyone has assumed you are called to do, you are good at. Doing things is not the same as knowing who you are. And Joseph had an understanding of who he was, and here's why, because he knew who created him. You cannot know yourself until you know who created you. There is a reason you are who you are. And yes, there is even a reason you are the way that you are. Say we're born in sin, we're born imperfect. Absolutely, but we're also born with inclinations and desires. We're not all born the same. We're born broken in different ways. You know, I'm broken in ways that can be redeeming and glorifying and can honor God. What do you mean, Mark? I mean, there are things I'm ashamed of and I try to hide, but at the same time, God says, no, you did those things. You've been through those things. I've brought you out of those things. I want you to tell people about them so that those who are dealing with those things can find help and hope and peace and joy, knowing there's a future for them. God can redeem your story no matter where it's been or what it's done. And so Joseph, though he's embarrassed at how he's landed in jail, he wants people to hear his story. Like, no, I didn't do it. I need you to know I've been honorable in everything I've done. And he was discovering his purpose. And maybe he would wake up and say, man, I guess maybe I'm a dream teller. Maybe God's just going to give me the ability to tell dreams. I don't know, but there's a purpose for me. But his story gets good. It gets really good, as a matter of fact. He's called one day because the cupbearer does remember him. On a morning when Pharaoh wakes up with a terrible nightmare. He tells all of his rulers and his leaders, and they have no answer for him. They have no idea what's going on. He says, here's what I dreamed. I dreamt that the Nile River, there were these 7 cows, and they were fat cows, ready to be cut up and turned into great steaks. I mean, they look good, you know what I'm saying? And then along came these skinny cows who hadn't been fed, and they ate up the fat cows. It was gross and nasty. So I woke up, and I was like, ooh, and then I went back to bed. And I had another dream. There were these corn stalks, and these corn stalks had big, fat ears of corn. It was great. It was like, man, this would be the best corn on the cob ever. And then lo and behold, they fell off, and what replaced them was these nasty, weak-looking, like they'd been driven by the east wind, leftover corn stalks. What does this mean, guys? And no one could tell him. And the cupbearer said, Pharaoh, I've done a great misdeed. I forgot about a guy. He can answer it. They bring up Joseph, and Joseph says something you need to hear. He says, it's not in my power to do it, but God can answer your dream. Now, I want you to think about this. You're called before the most powerful man in the world, and he's been told you can do something, and the first thing you do is say, not me, but God, man. He gets all the credit. Boy, God brought you to prison. God put you in Potiphar's house. God ain't been on your side, it looks like, bro, but he's still going to honor God because he knows who he is and what God has for him. Hear me, you may be going through your deepest, darkest day, but I believe God has a plan and a purpose. Now, sometimes, let's not get it twisted here. Sometimes we get in trouble because of things we do. Let it be said, Joseph was not in jail because of what he did, okay? We need to draw a line here. Don't blame God for mistakes you made and you did and you walked into it and he was like, bad idea, bad idea, bad idea. I don't like it, but I told you so. You know, like don't blame God for that. But there are things that happen in life we have no control over. And so Joseph goes before him and he tells him, here's what it means. It means you're going to have 7 great years. There's going to be plenty of harvest, man. It's going to be great. Everybody's going to have more food than they know what to do with. But then you're going to have 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh says, oh, what are we going to do? And Joseph says, what I would do. And he starts talking and people start whispering like, yeah, like he kind of runs the jail. He's really good with numbers and stuff. And then they're like, yeah, I heard he like made Potiphar like really wealthy and helped him. And Pharaoh says, okay, you're in charge. Right? Everybody wants somebody else to be in charge. You notice that? And he says, wait, you're in charge. Genesis chapter 41, read verse 41. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. It's on you, bud. You're in charge. You can sense the politician in this guy, right? Like, he's the one that's responsible. Verse 42. Then Pharaoh took his signet, his ring, off his hand. This is what made the law of the land, and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen. You notice that? The jacket's back. Yeah, y'all saw that. We came back right to it. The jacket's back. Clothed him in garments of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck. So God took his jacket, gave him back a jacket and a gold chain. So I'm just saying, y'all, you can trust God. Verse 43, all right? Verse 43, and he had him ride in the second chariot, which he had, and they cried out before him, bow the knee. A dream he had 20 years before that he had maybe even forgotten about, God had not forgotten about. They said, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. And later his parents, his brothers would come, not knowing who he was, when his brothers came, and they would bow that knee. And sure enough, his story was full, it was complete. But that's not why God did. Did God do it just to let his brothers bow the knee? No, you missed the whole purpose. The land of Egypt went through a famine that they were prepared for because of Joseph's wisdom, because God used him. And they didn't just have enough food for Egypt. They had so much food that they had stored up that other parts of the world came to Egypt and they fed them, including his brothers, but not just his brothers. Now, I want you to think about this. If this famine is so severe that it affects Egypt and the surrounding countries, how many people would have died of starvation if Pharaoh had not found this Joseph guy, if Joseph had never been in jail, if Joseph had never been in Potiphar's house, if his brothers had never sold him? Do you understand that Joseph went through 17 hard years to save millions of lives? It's not just about Joseph getting his jacket back. It's about God redeeming a sad story to save many, to save millions of people. But what if somewhere along the line, what if at Potiphar's house he had gotten bitter and angry and said, no more, I'm done? What if in jail he had said, that's it. It's been years since I told those guys their dreams, they forgot about me. But he didn't. He was faithful. And through his suffering, many were saved. Joseph was a slave, Joseph was a prisoner, and Joseph was a ruler. But wherever Joseph found himself, he was a leader. Hear me. I know you may not like your job. I know you may not like the season of life you find yourself in. I know you may not think things are going the way you thought they would. Be a leader where you are now. Be found faithful in the small issues that you've been trusted with. Be found faithful. Kevin and I were up at Chick-fil-A this week, and one of the girls that works there came out and asked if we want a refill, and so we started talking to her. She's 20 years old. She's from Portsmouth. She started working there when she was 17. Now, when she said that, my own little judgments come in. I never worked fast food because I didn't want to work fast food. I was above fast food. But you know what she said? She said, I worked here and I worked hard, and then they put me on this management team, and then they put me on this traveling team, and every month she goes out and she helps grand openings of big Chick-fil-A's. She's working for corporate Chick-fil-A and her local Chick-fil-A, and she's only been there 3 years. Do you know why this girl's doing that? Because she's a hard worker and she's been found faithful in the things that she does. And she said, I'm going to work at corporate one day. You watch. And I felt pretty bad because when I was 17, I frowned upon, I would never work fast food. And I've heard some of our people say, man, I can't do that. But she was faithful in the little things, and sure enough, she was elevated and she was trusted in a very short amount of time. So let me encourage you, wherever you find yourself, be faithful. And of course, let me encourage you, this does require faith. Being an adult requires a whole lot of faith, a whole lot of hope. And this morning, I have faith and I have hope, and here's why. Because I know who created me, and I know who I am, and I know what he has for me. In this story, we read of this Joseph who went through much suffering to save many. And he is an archetype. He is a prototype of Jesus who will come later and suffer for many, who will die for many so that many can be saved. This morning, the good news is this: who you are, you're a human. And what that means is you're not like every other living organism on this planet. You've been created in the image of God, and that's why you ask questions that no other living organism on this planet asks. You ask questions that animals, that plants do not consider in their mind and wonder to themselves. You ask questions like, why am I here? Where did I come from? What happens after this? That's because you were created in God's image. And God has a love for you. He desires you. He desires to know you. And he sent his son Jesus to suffer and die and raise from the dead so that we could be saved. Not from famine, not from starvation like this story, but from spiritual hunger, from spiritual death. Because there's more to life than what we see here. There's not just food, money, and stuff like we see here. There is an eternity at stake. There is another world that our heart longs for. And this morning, Jesus came so that you could know God, so that you could have faith. And being an adult means we have to deal and struggle with, what does faith look like? What does it look like to believe when I'm an adult? Because, look, a grown-up gospel is a lot different than a children's gospel. You remember the stories you were probably told in junior church. You probably remember the stories and when you heard this story, you didn't hear about him saving millions. You know what you heard? That jacket, though, man, that sounded great. But you get older and you realize the story of Joseph is about suffering, about faith in the midst of suffering, and clinging to hope when there was no reason to cling to hope, and how that hope was realized. This morning, I have hope and I have faith when I'm in suffering and when I'm not in suffering because of what Jesus offers and what he's done for me. And if you're here this morning and you don't have a relationship with Jesus, I want you to know he loves you, he cares for you, he came to die for you. Not to die a quick death. Jesus could have been born in 1955. He could have been born in 2005 when the death panel or the death sentence that he would have received would have been quick and, and easier than dying slowly on a tree. Painless almost. He could have been injected. He could have been electrocuted. But instead, he came at a point in history where he knew the way that they crucified and killed people was slow, was torturous, was hard. He died a slow death. And he suffered through every minute. And he loved the people who were doing it to him. He prayed for them out loud. And he loved the people he was doing it for today and in time past. It's Jesus, he loves you, and he wants you to know who you are. He wants you to know why you are the way you are. And he wants you to have a relationship with him. So this morning, what does faith look like? When I'm in prison, when I feel like a slave, when I feel like nothing's going my way, when I feel like my family doesn't love me, when I feel like everybody's out to get me. Faith and hope, they hold on when there's no reason to hold on. I hope you have that faith this morning. I hope you have that faith in Jesus. And I hope you will realize your story's not over. Your purpose hasn't been realized just yet. There's a reason for what you're going through. And if you have been through some things, and maybe you've now discovered it, hey, pour it out on others, man. Joseph didn't go up to Pharaoh and say, yep, there's your dream. Good luck, peace out, man. Y'all figure that out. I'm doing my thing. No. He said, if I can help, let me help. You know why we have faith, guys? Some of us in the room, we've been a Christian 20 years. We've been saved a long time. We've been through some trials, some struggles. You've been through that so you can help someone. So you can pour into the lives of others. Be a leader right where you are. Whether you find yourself being a ruler or a slave or a brother in a pit or just somebody who's in prison spiritually, you need to be a leader going through what you're going through. Hey, this morning, if you don't have faith, if you don't have a relationship with Jesus, man, let's get that settled. Let's deal with that. Let's start a relationship with him so you can see the purpose through the struggle. And if you are a Christian, man, start pouring it out. Start helping others. Start pouring into the lives of others who are going through what you've been through or maybe are going through what you're going through. Because that is the purpose, the story, the timeline of the gospel of Jesus. Would you pray with me this morning?